In a courtroom divided by racial tensions, a black boy stood and declared to the judge, "You're my mom." What happened next left everyone speechless. The courtroom was packed that morning. Rows of people sat in tense silence, their eyes shifting between the judge's bench and the defendant's table. It was a case that had captured local news attention. A young black boy named Jaden, no older than 12, had found himself in juvenile court for allegedly trespassing in a wealthy neighborhood. Jaden sat at the defendant's table, his small frame dwarfed by the oversized wooden chair. He wore a faded hoodie and jeans that seemed too big for him, his sneakers scuffed from wear. His hands clutched the edge of the table, trembling slightly. Across the room, the judge, a woman in her late 40s with sharp features and an air of authority, prepared to begin the hearing. Judge Rebecca Hart was known for her no-nonsense demeanor. She had a reputation for being particularly tough on cases involving youth offenders, especially those from troubled backgrounds. As she flipped through the case file, her cold, detached expression betrayed no emotion. The bailiff called the room to order. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Hart," he announced, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged courtroom. Everyone stood, their movements stiff, the weight of the proceedings heavy in the air. Rebecca glanced down at Jaden, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You may be seated," she said, her voice crisp and professional. As the murmurs of shuffling feet subsided, she addressed the court. "This case involves charges of trespassing and loitering. Defendant, you are accused of entering private property without permission. How do you plead?" Jaden looked up, his brown eyes wide and glassy, as if he were holding back tears. His lawyer, a public defender who seemed overworked and underprepared, leaned down to whisper something in his ear. Jaden hesitated, his voice catching in his throat. "Not guilty," he finally said, his voice barely audible. The judge gave a curt nod, jotting something down in her notes. "Proceed with opening statements," she said, motioning to the prosecution. As the prosecutor began outlining the case, Jaden's gaze wandered, scanning the room nervously. His eyes landed on Rebecca again, and his breathing quickened. He studied her face, his expression shifting from fear to something more profound, recognition. The prosecutor droned on, recounting the events of the alleged trespassing, how Jaden had been found in a gated community after dark, how a homeowner had called the police, and how Jaden had been uncooperative when questioned. But the words seemed to fade into the background as Jaden's focus remained fixed on the judge. Rebecca noticed his stare, her brow furrowing slightly. "Defendant, is there something you'd like to say?" she asked, her tone tinged with impatience. Jaden hesitated, his small hands gripping the edge of the table tighter. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes now on him. He opened his mouth to speak but then stopped, his lips trembling. Rebecca sighed. "If you're not going to speak, let's move on." "I know you," Jaden blurted out, his voice shaky but loud enough to carry across the room. The words hung in the air, met with confused murmurs from the audience. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Jaden's chest rose and fell as he tried to steady his breathing. I know you," he repeated, his voice cracking. "You're my mom." Gasps rippled through the room. Someone in the back audibly whispered, "What did he just say?" Rebecca froze, her pen hovering above her notepad. For the first time in her career, she looked completely caught off guard. Her eyes locked on Jaden, scanning his face as if trying to piece together a puzzle she hadn't known existed. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice low but trembling ever so slightly. "You're my mom," Jaden said again, tears spilling down his cheeks. His voice was raw, filled with a pain that seemed far older than his years. The courtroom was utterly still, as if the world had stopped spinning for a moment. Even the prosecutor, who had been rifling through papers, sat frozen in place. Rebecca's hand trembled as she set her pen down. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice faltering. But her expression betrayed her. Something in her eyes shifted, confusion, denial, and something deeper, fear. Jaden's small voice cut through the silence. You gave me away when I was a baby. My foster mom told me everything. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in, the whispers from the audience growing louder. She glanced at the bailiff, then at the public defender, who looked as stunned as everyone else. I need a moment, Rebecca said, her voice cracking. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. We'll take a short recess. As she retreated to her chambers, her legs felt unsteady beneath her. She couldn't shake the image of Jaden's tear-streaked face. His words echoed in her mind, "You're my mom." Inside her chambers, Rebecca pressed her hands against the edge of her desk, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The weight of the revelation threatened to crush her. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments of a past she had tried so hard to bury. Gasps filled the room as memories Rebecca had buried long ago began to surface, painful, messy fragments of her past she had worked so hard to forget. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Jaden sat back in his chair, tears still streaming down his face. The room buzzed with hushed speculation. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, sensing a story far bigger than they had anticipated. The boy had just unraveled a secret no one had seen coming. But for Rebecca Hart, it was a secret that threatened to shatter the life she had carefully built. Rebecca stood in her chambers, the echo of Jaden's words bouncing around her mind like a haunting melody. "You're my mom." She gripped the edge of her desk, her knuckles white as she tried to steady herself. The air felt thick, each breath a struggle. For years, she had locked that part of her life away, hidden behind her degrees, her judicial robe, and the walls of her courtroom. Yet here it was, unraveling before her in a way she could never have anticipated. Rebecca hadn't thought of that time in decades. She had been just 18, a scared girl from a small conservative town, when she found out she was pregnant. The memory came flooding back now, the arguments with her parents, the shame in their eyes, and the crushing decision to give her baby up for adoption. It was the only way forward, or so they had convinced her. She inhaled sharply, pushing the memories back down where they belonged. She was Judge Rebecca Hart now, a respected authority with a reputation to uphold. She couldn't let this boy's words derail her life. But no matter how hard she tried to compose herself, the image of Jaden's tear-streaked face lingered. A knock on the door broke her thoughts. "Judge Hart," the voice of her clerk was cautious, almost hesitant. "The courtroom is waiting." Rebecca straightened, forcing herself into the calm, authoritative persona she wore like armor. She adjusted her robe, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The moment she stepped out, the murmurs from the courtroom quieted. All eyes were on her as she resumed her place at the bench. The tension in the room was palpable. Jaden sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes red but defiant. His public defender whispered something in his ear, but Jaden's focus remained fixed on Rebecca. Rebecca cleared her throat, her voice firm. "Court is back in session. Let's proceed." The prosecutor stood, looking hesitant. "Your Honor, given the unusual circumstances, I think it's appropriate to confirm the defendant's statement." "Is there any merit to?" "That's enough," Rebecca interrupted, her tone sharp. She couldn't let this turn into a spectacle. "We are here to address the charges, not unfounded claims." But Jaden wasn't finished. He stood abruptly, his small frame trembling with the weight of his emotions. "It's not a claim," he said, his voice breaking. "It's the truth." "Sit down, young man," Rebecca ordered, her voice faltering slightly. "No!" Jaden shouted, the pain in his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You don't get to ignore me! You don't get to pretend I don't exist!" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Rebecca couldn't hide her shock. Her heart pounded as she stared at the boy, his words hitting her like a tidal wave. She wanted to shout back, to deny everything, but the conviction in his eyes was undeniable. "I remember your face," Jaden continued, tears streaming down his cheeks. "My foster mom showed me a picture of you. She said you were scared, that you wanted me to have a better life. But why didn't you come back for me? Why didn't you even try?" The room was deathly silent, every person hanging on his words. Rebecca opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't been since she was that scared 18-year-old girl. Finally, she forced herself to speak. This isn't the time or place for this discussion, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jaden's lawyer stood, his face pale. Your Honor, with all due respect, my client deserves answers. If there's any truth to his statement, it changes everything about how we proceed. Rebecca felt the walls closing in again. She looked around the room at the sea of expectant faces and realized there was no escape. Her carefully constructed life was crumbling before her eyes. But before she could respond, the doors to the courtroom swung open. A woman in her late 40s with a tired face and kind eyes stepped inside. Her presence immediately drew attention, her hesitant movements betraying her unease. Jaden turned to look, and his face lit up with a mix of relief and anguish. Mom! He called out, his voice breaking. Rebecca stared at the woman, her heart sinking further. Gloria Adams? The name was like a jolt to her system. She hadn't heard it in years, but she would never forget it. Gloria was the social worker who had facilitated Jaden's adoption, the one who had assured Rebecca she was doing the right thing all those years ago. Your Honor, Gloria said softly, her voice trembling. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it's time we all had the truth. Rebecca's throat tightened, her mind racing. She couldn't believe this was happening, not here, not now. Jaden turned back to Rebecca, his eyes pleading. Please, he said, his voice soft but insistent. Just tell me why. That's all I want to know. Rebecca's composure shattered. She looked at Jaden, at Gloria, and then back again, her heart heavy with the weight of the truth she had tried so hard to bury. In the courtroom, filled with curious and judgmental eyes, Judge Rebecca Hart realized she couldn't hide from the truth anymore. Her voice was barely audible as she said, Recess. This court is in recess. She banged her gavel and stood, fleeing to her chambers before anyone could stop her. Behind her, the courtroom erupted into a flurry of whispers, questions, and speculation. But none of that mattered to Jaden. He slumped back into his seat, his heart heavy. For him, it was no longer about the charges or the courtroom. It was about the woman he had dreamed of his whole life, the woman who had just walked away from him again. The murmur in the courtroom grew louder as Judge Hart's chamber's door slammed shut behind her. Jaden sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped, staring blankly at the polished wood in front of him. The weight of rejection was crushing. Around him, the courtroom was a storm of whispered speculations. Gloria Adams stepped forward, her presence commanding attention even amid the case. She walked to Jaden's side, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. It's okay, Jaden, she whispered. You've been brave enough already. Jaden shook his head, his eyes brimming with tears. I just wanted her to say something, he said, his voice barely audible. Why won't she even talk to me? Gloria didn't have an answer. She had been a social worker for decades, guiding children through the labyrinth of the foster system, but Jaden's case had always weighed heavily on her heart. She had seen him bounce between homes, waiting for someone to claim him permanently. And now here he was, facing the one person who could give him the answers he'd been searching for, only to be met with silence. Rebecca, meanwhile, paced the confines of her chambers. Her heart pounded in her chest, her palms clammy as the enormity of the situation hit her. This was no longer about maintaining courtroom decorum or upholding her reputation. This was about a boy she had given up on long ago. She sat at her desk, her hands shaking as she pulled open a drawer. From within, she retrieved an old photograph, its edges frayed from years of being hidden away. The photo was of a newborn baby swaddled in a yellow blanket, his tiny face scrunched up in sleep. She traced the outline of the photo with her finger, tears stinging her eyes. Rebecca had spent years convincing herself that she had done the right thing. She had been just a teenager back then, scared and overwhelmed. Her parents had insisted that giving up the baby was the best option for everyone involved. "You'll ruin your future," they had said. "He'll have a better life with another family." But as the years passed, the memory of that baby never left her. She had wondered about him constantly. Did he grow up happy? Was he loved? Did he ever think about the mother who let him go? And now here he was, Jaden, standing in her courtroom and shattering the walls she had built around herself. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat as the sound of a gentle knock pulled her out of her thoughts. "Judge Hart." It was Gloria's voice, soft but firm. "May I come in?" Rebecca hesitated, glancing at the photo in her hand before quickly shoving it back into the drawer. She straightened her robe and cleared her throat. "Come in." The door opened, and Gloria stepped inside, closing it quietly behind her. She regarded Rebecca with a calm, knowing look. "You don't have to say anything," Gloria began. "But you should know that boy out there is hurting. He's been through more than any child should ever have to endure." Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm aware of the situation," she said curtly. "No, you're not," Gloria countered, her tone soft but firm. "Jaden's been in the system his whole life. He's been let down by every adult he ever trusted. And now he's standing in front of the one person he's dreamed of finding, only to feel like he's being abandoned all over again." Rebecca flinched at Gloria's words but didn't respond. Gloria took a step closer. "I was there, you know," she said, her voice softening. "The day you signed the papers. You cried so hard I thought you'd change your mind. But your parents wouldn't let you, would they?" Rebecca's composure cracked, a tear slipping down her cheek. She turned away, unable to meet Gloria's gaze. "It was a long time ago," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not over," Gloria pressed gently. "You have a chance now to give Jaden something he's been searching for his entire life. A sense of belonging, a connection, a truth." Rebecca sank into her chair, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know how to face him," she admitted. "What could I possibly say to make up for everything he's been through?" Gloria placed a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "It's not about saying the perfect thing. It's about being honest. Jaden doesn't need excuses or apologies. He just needs to know you care." For a moment, the room was silent. Rebecca took a shaky breath and nodded. "I need a moment," she said. Gloria gave her a small smile and stepped out of the chambers, leaving Rebecca to wrestle with her thoughts. Back in the courtroom, Jaden sat quietly, his head bowed. Gloria approached him, crouching down to meet his gaze. "She's not perfect, Jaden," she said softly. "She's scared, just like you. But I think she's starting to understand how much you need her." Jaden's lip quivered, but he nodded, wiping at his eyes. "I just want her to tell me why," he said again, his voice breaking. Rebecca finally emerged from her chambers, her expression unreadable but her steps steady. She walked to the bench, her gaze briefly meeting Jaden's before she spoke. "This court is here to address legal matters," she began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But I understand there are truths that cannot be ignored." "Matters," she began, her voice even, "but I realize now that there is something far more important at stake." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "Jaden, I owe you the truth. If you'll allow me, I'd like to speak with you privately." The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Rebecca silenced them with a single gesture. "This is not a spectacle," she said firmly. "This is a personal matter, and I ask for your respect." Jaden stared at her, his wide eyes full of hope and trepidation. Slowly, he nodded. As the bailiff escorted them to a private conference room, Rebecca felt the weight of decades pressing down on her. This was her chance to face the past and the boy who had waited his whole life for her to show up. The conference room was small, its walls stark white, which somehow made the tension between Rebecca and Jaden feel even more suffocating. A single table sat in the center of the room, with two chairs facing each other. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving only the muffled hum of the courthouse in the distance. Rebecca stood frozen by the door, gripping the handle as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Jaden sat across from her, his small hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. For the first time, he looked unsure of himself, the defiance head shown in the courtroom replaced by a raw, unshielded vulnerability. "You can sit down," Jaden said quietly, his voice cracking. It was strange, an invitation from a boy to the woman who was supposed to have all the power. Rebecca nodded stiffly and walked to the chair, lowering herself slowly, as though the weight of the moment might break her. She clasped her hands in front of her, her fingers twisting together in an effort to steady herself. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and the pain of years lost. Finally, Jaden broke the silence. "Why did you give me away?" he asked, his voice trembling. His eyes brimmed with tears, but he held her gaze, determined to get the answers he had spent his whole life wondering about. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She looked at Jaden, really looked at him for the first time. His deep brown eyes, so full of hurt, reminded her of the baby she had held in her arms all those years ago, a baby she had told herself she wasn't ready to care for. "I was young," she began, her voice shaking. "I was just 18. I had no idea how to raise a child, and my parents, they told me it was the only option." She paused, swallowing hard. "They said you would have a better life without me." Jaden blinked, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. "Better?" he echoed. "You thought foster care was better? Being shuffled from house to house, wondering if anyone would ever want me. That's what you thought was better?" Rebecca flinched at his words, tears spilling over her cheeks. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know that's what would happen to you. I thought you'd be adopted by a family who could give you everything I couldn't. But you didn't check, did you?" Jaden's voice rose, his anger spilling over. "You didn't come back. You didn't even try to find me." Rebecca wiped at her tears, her heart breaking with every word. "You're right," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I didn't. I was scared, too scared to face what I had done. I thought if I stayed away, it would make things easier for you and for me." Jaden's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Do you know what it's like to wait for someone who never shows up?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Every time I got sent to a new home, I thought maybe this is the one where she'll find me. But you never came." Rebecca couldn't hold back her sobs anymore. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of her choices crushing her. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry, Jaden. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I failed you." Jaden stared at her, his expression softening ever so slightly. He had spent so long imagining this moment, dreaming of what he would say if he ever met his birth mother. But now that she was here, broken and remorseful in front of him, the anger he had clung to for so many years began to waver. "Do you even care now?" he asked, his voice quieter. "Or am I just another mistake you're trying to forget?" Rebecca looked up, her tear-streaked face full of anguish. "Of course I care," she said, her voice firm despite the tremble in it. "You were never a mistake, Jaden. Not for 1 second. I've thought about you every day of my life. I didn't know how to fix what I'd done." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jaden's shoulders slumped, his anger giving way to exhaustion. "I don't want to hate you," he said softly, "but I don't know how to forgive you either." Rebecca reached out hesitantly, her hand trembling as it rested on the table between them. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "But if you'll let me, I want to be here for you now. I can't change the past, but I can be part of your future, if that's what you want." Jaden stared at her hand for a long moment, his own hands twitching as if he wasn't sure what to do. Slowly, cautiously, he reached out and placed his hand over hers. Over hers. "I don't know if it's enough," he said quietly. "It's a start," Rebecca replied, her voice full of hope for the first time. A small flicker of understanding passed between them. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning, a fragile connection between a mother and the son she had lost but never forgotten. The courtroom was nearly empty by the time Jaden and Rebecca stepped out of the conference room. The bailiff had cleared the gallery, leaving only Gloria and Jaden's public defender waiting by the bench. Gloria looked up first, her expression filled with quiet hope as she saw Jaden walking beside Rebecca. For the first time that day, Jaden's face was not etched with anger or pain. Instead, he seemed tentative, as though unsure of what the future might hold. Rebecca, on the other hand, was visibly drained. Her eyes were red, and her shoulders sagged under the emotional weight of the conversation they had just shared. But in her heart, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of clarity. Gloria approached them slowly, glancing between the two. "How did it go?" she asked softly. Jaden hesitated, glancing at Rebecca. "We talked," he said. "She told me the truth." Gloria nodded, her warm smile encouraging. "That's a good start." Rebecca cleared her throat, addressing Gloria with a voice that was still finding its strength. "I want to do better for him," she said. "I don't know how yet, but I'm not going to walk away this time." Gloria studied Rebecca for a moment, her gaze full of understanding. "It's going to take time," she said. "But if you're willing to be there for him, you'll find a way." Rebecca nodded, the determination in her eyes solidifying. She turned to Jaden, crouching slightly so they were at eye level. "I don't expect you to trust me right away," she said gently. "But I'm here. Whatever you need, I'll be here." Jaden's lip quivered as he looked at her. For so many years, he had dreamed of this moment, meeting his birth mother, demanding answers, and maybe even finding some kind of closure. But the reality was far messier than he had imagined. Still, something in Rebecca's voice told him she meant what she said. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. Rebecca reached out, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder. "That's okay," she said. "We'll take it one step at a time." Jaden glanced at Gloria, who gave him a reassuring nod. Slowly, he took a deep breath and said, "I want to try. I want to know who you really are." Rebecca's heart swelled at his words, and she felt a tear slip down her cheek. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said softly. The next few weeks were a delicate dance between healing and learning. Rebecca took the first step by arranging regular visits with Jaden. She insisted they meet in places where he felt comfortable, parks, libraries, and even the youth center he frequented. Their conversation started slowly, often awkward and halting, but with each meeting, Jaden grew more open, sharing pieces of his life that Rebecca had missed. He told her about the foster homes he had lived in, the friends he had made and lost, and the dreams he had for his future. Rebecca, in turn, shared pieces of her own story. She told him about her struggles as a young girl, her journey to becoming a judge, and the regret that had weighed on her heart for years. One afternoon, as they sat on a park bench, Jaden asked her, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you kept me?" Rebecca took a long breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Every single day," she admitted. "But I can't change what I did back then. All I can do is try to make things right now." Jaden nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I'm still mad sometimes," he said. "That's okay," Rebecca replied. "You're allowed to be mad. I just hope someday you'll let me earn your forgiveness." Jaden turned to her, his expression softer than it had been in weeks. "Maybe," he said quietly. Their relationship didn't transform overnight, but it began to grow in small, meaningful ways. Rebecca surprised Jaden one day by showing up at his youth center to watch him play basketball. Jaden, caught off guard initially, seemed embarrassed. But when she cheered for him after a perfect shot, he couldn't help but smile. Rebecca also worked with Gloria to understand how she could support Jaden in the long term. She researched therapy options, explored programs that could help him build confidence, and even started attending community events to better understand the world he had grown up in. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of tension when old wounds reopened and moments of doubt when Rebecca wondered if she would ever truly make up for the years they had lost. But every time she felt herself faltering, She remembered the look in Jaden's eyes when he had placed his hand over hers in the conference room. Months later, the courtroom where they had first met looked very different. Jaden stood beside Rebecca at a small ceremony, surrounded by a handful of friends, Gloria, and a few courthouse staff members. The judge presiding over the event smiled warmly. "Today we celebrate a new chapter," she said. "Rebecca Hart has formally petitioned to take legal guardianship of Jaden Williams, and both parties have agreed to move forward." The room broke into applause, but for Jaden and Rebecca, the noise faded into the background. Rebecca turned to Jaden, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice steady with emotion. Jaden looked up at her, a small but genuine smile breaking across his face. "I think we're going to be okay," he said quietly. Rebecca nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "So do I." As they left the courtroom together, hand in hand, the past no longer felt like an anchor holding them down. Instead, it became a foundation, one they could build on together. For the first time in years, they both felt the weight of hope, stronger than fear, guiding them forward into a future filled with possibility.